Two. Welcome to our 11th episode of One Work, 5 Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Glad to be here as usual. We have a rainy afternoon here in Lynchburg, Virginia, but it's good for the crops, good for all the things that I'm growing. So
it's rainy here too. Well, it's starting to, drizzling on and off. So, well, Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor of philosophy and history who has over 20 published books on Thomas Jefferson and over 100 essays. And you can find all of the locations of his books and his essays in the video description. He's taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University. With our show, One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. Our 11th episode today is on Thomas Jefferson's letter to his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, dated the 24th of November, 1808. But first, let me give you an introduction to the letter. Thomas Jefferson had many children, but only 2 would live to adulthood. Daughters Martha, 1772 to 1836, and Maria, 1778 to 1804. Mary would live only to her 26th year. He thus had no son, though he did take into Monticello the children, including sons of Dabney Carr, upon the latter's untimely death at the age of 29. And he treated the boys inasmuch as he could as his sons. The closest he came to having a biological son was his grandson and namesake, Thomas Jefferson Randolph. His years were 1792 to 1875, whom he greatly loved and whose love was fully reciprocated. Later in 1808, Jefferson pens a concerned and fatherly letter to his grandson. That letter is the subject of this week's One Work, 5 Questions. Okay, are you ready for question 1?
I'm ready. I like his grandson very much, and I don't think there's ever been written a book on his grandson. I wish someone, I'm probably not going to do it myself, but the 2 men who loved each other dearly. So.
Oh, and here's a picture we have of Thomas Jefferson Randolph.
As a young man, obviously.
Yes, very nice. Okay, question number 1. Thomas Jefferson speaks to Thomas Jefferson Randolph of the latter being thrown on a wide world among entire strangers without a friend or guardian to advise, and of being so young too and with so little experience of mankind. He warns his grandson, your dangers are great and still your safety must rest on yourself. Where is Thomas Jefferson Randolph, and what are the great dangers of which Thomas Jefferson warns?
Well, his grandson is off to school in Philadelphia to learn about the natural sciences, and Jefferson is recalling, his own when he was a young man, and he was after his father dies, and everything that was thrown on his lap, and his own adventures and misadventures when he was off to school too. And it shows special attention and affection for his grandson, because his grandson is young at the time, and he's worried about him being lost in Philadelphia, which at the time is as large a city as you have in the Jejune country. So it shows great concern for his grandson. So Thomas Jefferson was in a similar situation, and he's worried about his grandson.
Yeah, I noticed in the letter too, he mentions his grandson may be at a disadvantage because his grandfather's the president.
Yep. Wouldn't you feel that way, trying to live up to his grandfather's image and ideals? And not
Oh, and and he was concerned about the people the haters, the people from political parties that didn't that weren't supportive of Jefferson's position in the White House. Yeah,
Yep.
that's a valid concern, very valid concern. Question number 2. The first question piggybacks to the second question, which concerns a great dilemma that Thomas Jefferson faced as a lad. You have compared that dilemma to the dilemma the Greek demigod Heracles faced. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, there's a video on YouTube that I posted about Jefferson's, the fork in the road that he came to early in life. And, I called it, I compared it to what the Greek demigod Heracles supposedly went through. Of course, he didn't exist, but there are stories of Heracles, being confronted by the goddess Hedone, pleasure, and the goddess Edite, of virtue. And Heracles thinks long and hard. Does he want a life of complete pleasure? Does he want a life of virtue, which is going to be a hard life? And he chooses virtue. He chooses the hard road because he will be loved by the gods and men. And I don't throw this in inadvertently. Jefferson was well read in ancient scholarship, and certainly, thoughts of something like this would have been. But he mentions this dilemma. He talks about when he was 14 years of age. He says in the letter, the whole care and direction of myself was thrown on myself entirely, without a relation or friend qualified to advise or guide me, and recollect the various sorts of bad company with which I associated from time to time. Right. So he's admitting that, he didn't always hang around the best sorts of company. He was hanging around people that introduced him to vice and pleasure and all the fun things in life, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, probably too young, but alcohol, and gaming, and pleasure, and all sorts of things that young boys and young men like to do, things that you'd find in the city. But he says, he had no friend or no one to advise him. And that's the problem with his grandson here. He has nobody. He's in Philadelphia by himself, and who's going to help him. He says, I am astonished I did not turn off with some of them and become as worthless to society as they were. Okay, and he talks about being acquainted with the right sort of people. So I mean, the difficulty here is he talks later in the letter, from the circumstances of my position, I was often thrown into the society of horse racers, card players, fox hunters, scientific and professional men, and of dignified men. And many a time have I asked myself, in the enthusiastic moment of the death of a fox, the victory of a favorite horse, the issue of a question eloquently argued at the bar or in the great council of the nation, well, which of these kinds of reputation should I prefer? That of a horse jockey, a fox hunter, an orator, an honest advocate of my country's rights? And he says, be assured, my dear Jefferson, that these little returns into ourselves, this self-catechizing, is not trifling nor useless, but leads to the prudent selection and steady pursuit of what is right. So this gets us back to Jefferson's habit of self-catechizing, of self-reflection, of which we talked of in prior sessions, right? He always went to bed self-reflecting, and he says these were, he doesn't tell his grandson what to do. Notice he said, make sure you choose to be an orator or to serve your country. He doesn't say that. It's in a sense, he says, if you want to be a fox hunter, fine, but think. And I think he's fairly clear that if you give the right sort of reflection to that, you're not going to want to live the hedonic, the lifestyle that seeks pleasure, but you're going to be in service to your fellow country.
Oh, great advice. He was a wonderful grandpa. Question number, are you ready for question 3?
I don't know. Let's see.
Okay. Question 3. Thomas Jefferson explains curiously that when involved in moral scenarios, he avoided extrication from the situation, not by moral reasoning, but by reflection on what on his morals. Dr. Small, Dr. With, and Peyton Randolph would have done in the same situation. Why is that?
Well, we'll talk about this at a future session, but he did not think that moral scenarios demanded use of reason at all. Each individual was equipped with a moral sense faculty, and that moral sense faculty is something you saw the right thing to do, or you felt it. Right? It's a sensory faculty, not a rational faculty. It's distinct from rationality, and it works independently of rationality. And this is where a lot of scholars go awry, I think. Really, the sole person that focuses on the independence of these faculties and how moral decision-making does not involve reason, in spite of a couple troubling letters, which I explain away in some of my writings. So we sense the right thing to do. And he says here, he says, I had the good fortune to become acquainted very early with some characters of very high standing and to feel the incessant wish that I could become what they were. Under temptations and difficulties, I would ask myself, what would Dr. Small, Dr. With, Peyton Randolph do in this situation? What course in it will ensure me their approbation, their approval? I am certain that this mode of deciding my conduct tended more to its correctness than any reasoning powers I possess. It's really not reasoning. Do not think your way through this. Put yourself in their place. Okay, it's what Adam Smith sort of tells you to do. The internal spectator, just to put yourself in the position of some other person whom you respect greatly. What would George Wythe do? The eminent lawyer and politician, the foremost lawyer in Virginia at the time, signer of the Declaration of Independence. What would George Wythe do? If I know I'm in a situation, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Ask yourself, what would a person of preeminent virtue do? And then the situation will melt away. The knot, he says in another place, the knot you thought Gordian, talking about Alexander the Great, the Gordian knot will untie itself.
Untie itself.
Yep, that's it. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Question 4. Thomas Jefferson in the letter warns his grandson against engagement with argumentative disputation with another. What are his reasons?
Well, he gives many, many reasons. That's a very loaded question. I mean, the gist of this letter is, this is something he says later in the letter. Says, it was one of the rules which above all others made Dr. Franklin the most amiable of men in society, never to contradict anybody. If he was urged to announce an opinion, he did it rather by asking questions, as if for information, or by suggesting doubts. In other words, he's using, Dr. Franklin would use Socratic method, unlike Dr. Holowchak, who in his visit to Monticello a couple days ago just got into a heated dispute with one of the tour guides because of what they were, the sort of junk they were talking about Thomas Jefferson and the relationship with Sally Hemings. And so as a passing by, I heard that and I sort of lost it. I didn't take the advice.
That on their cell phone.
Maybe someone did, who knows? But it's all right. I didn't expect to hear some of the stupid stuff I heard in this notion. But I mean, the idea is to Jefferson had a rule too. He said, when angry, count to 10. When really angry, count to n100. And very stoical in some sense. So back to the answer the question. So the one reason is following this rule of Dr. Franklin. Another, he says, it is the practice of sacrificing to those whom we meet in society all the little conveniences and preferences which will gratify them and deprive us of nothing worth a moment's consideration, to give pleasing and flattering turn to our expressions which will conciliate others and make them pleased with us as well. He's talking about using good humor. And he's contrasting good humor with politeness. Always be of good humor. And good humor, he says, it's one of the preservatives of peace and tranquility. He says it's among the most effectual. Its effect is well imitated and aided artificially by politeness. So good humor. And he contrasts that with politeness, which he calls artificial good humor. It covers the natural want of it and ends by rendering habitual a substitute nearly equivalent to the real virtue. So, be cheerful and open and honest with people. Don't be polite, because politeness is, okay, I know I really don't want to be this way, but I'm going to do it because I'm sort of forced to do it. So, that was sort of Dr. Franklin's rule as well. Let me see some of the other reasons. He says, when I hear another express an opinion which is not mine, I say to myself, he has a right to his opinion as I to mine. Why should I question it? His error does me no injury, and shall I become a Don Quixote, Don Quixote, to bring all men by force of argument to one opinion? So, he doesn't want to say I have a right to deprive another person of his own opinion. And going back to what Dr. Benjamin Franklin said, look, if you have an opinion and you're set in your opinion, and I have my opinion and I'm set in mine, I enter into disputation, you're not going to be inclined to change by listening to anything I have to say. People hold on to their opinions like they hold on to their favorite light beer. No matter what, you can show them through a taste test that this light beer tastes better than another, but they're going to still buy their favorite beer, whether it tastes worse or not. So they hold on to their opinions.
Right.
And he cautions, a wonderful quote here. He says, he talks about two sorts of people you're going to meet at school. The first is of young students just entered the threshold of science with a first view of its outlines, not yet filled up with the details in modifications which a further progress would bring to their knowledge. So in other words, you come in, and certain Holowchak was like this when he was young. You want to learn, you have a small amount of knowledge in your head, and you want to show people everything. So you dispute and you argue about everything, and that's okay when you're young. It's what you're supposed to do, and it's so forth. You throw out your ideas, and other people throw out theirs, and you wind up disputing, and nothing much is gained. So he talks about these young students with energy and ideas, and the other consists of the ill-tempered and rude men in their society who have taken up a passion for politics. He says, in parentheses, good humor and politeness never introduced in mixed society, a question in which they perceive there will be a difference of opinion. So you've got, these ill-tempered, rude people who love, he's speaking of the Alexander Hamiltons sometimes, that love politics, and the young men that are in the Virginia House of Delegates, he says at the time, they have their opinions and they want to be heard. So they talk, they give their opinions, and they're not open to listening to other people. There is a wonderful quote that Thomas Jefferson says to when a friend tells him something when they're listening to members of the House of Delegates, and a friend says something about the people, these young politicians who speak incessantly and really say nothing. And Jefferson objected to that. He should speak and say something, and speak curtly, not curtly, but succinctly. And his friend says, well, why don't you contradict them? And Jefferson says, to contradict them is very easy. To quiet them is impossible. So in other words, I can show you that what you're saying makes no sense, but that's not going to quiet you. In fact, it might be like fanning the flames here. So the idea is, he says, get by them, therefore, Jeff, as you would by an angry bull. It is not for a man of sense to dispute the road with such an animal. A wonderful quote, and tells you a lot about Jefferson. It also tells you about disputants and the sort of psychological understanding. Is Jefferson is bright enough to know these people want to express their opinions. They have their opinions. They're not going to change their mind. They're angry. And you're not going to discuss anything intelligently with an angry person. So it's just like an angry bull. You don't charge at an angry bull because you're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
You avoid the angry bull. So that's his answer to that question. Pretty cool stuff there.
Oh, well, my favorite reason was to not get shot. When he warns his grandson. He's seen many I've seen many of their getting warm, becoming rude, and shooting one another.
Yeah, that happened.
That's enough to keep you from arguing.
I live in Daniels Hill, and there's the residence of Dr. Cabell, where Point of Honor is called Point of Honor because that was just outside of the city of Lynchburg. And people who angered each other, Jefferson wants some attention. What do you want? You got to go outside. You go outside a bit, Jeff. They would come there to settle disputes with the point of a pistol, and it was called Point of Honor for that reason. So there were presumably a lot of fights. These fights would happen often between editors of different newspapers who, one editor says something, another says something else. Jeffy's got to get in his.
Hi, Jeffy.
We're talking about you. So
That's the current day Mr.
yeah, that you don't want to get shot either.
Yeah. I didn't know if he was trying to be funny or, just.
Well, it's probably serious. Jefferson by now, he didn't.
Yeah.
He wasn't a yuck kind of guy. He was a very serious person, right?
Question number 5. Jeffy, are you ready?
Are you ready, Bud?
Thomas Jefferson knew, and certainly so did Thomas Jefferson Randolph, know the hardships his grandson would face just by being grandson. Did Thomas Jefferson Randolph reasonably cope?
So that's a good question. And the answer is yes. Thomas Mann Randolph, who married Jefferson's oldest, became, this will be, for a future 1 Word 5 Questions. He came to hate his wife. He came to hate his station. And he was always friendly and kindly to Thomas Jefferson, but presumably came to hate Jefferson. Because I think it was difficult being the son-in-law. He was governor of Virginia as well, and he got involved in politics. His son-in-law, but being son-in-law to Thomas Jefferson, he had to live up to Jefferson's enormously large intellect, which was no small beer, no small task, and he couldn't. And I think it was very frustrating. So as much as he wanted to sort of be like Jefferson, he did not possess the intellect. Now, his grandson was not of the intellectual capacity in the least of Thomas Jefferson, that we know. And Jefferson himself realized that, but he loved his grandson. One of the things I think that's wonderful about their relationship, he loved him dearly for who he was. He understood his grandson had a wonderful, magnanimous heart. He was a very loving young man. And as we said, you said earlier, intro, he loved his grandson dearly. It was his son that he never had, and his grandson adored and worshiped his grandfather, never would let anybody say anything bad about his grandfather. So it was, through all intents and purposes, that was his son. That was the son he never had. And when Thomas, later in life, came back after the presidency to, I'm giving you guys a little extra information for no money. After the presidency, came back to run his farm, and everything was in disarray because the overseers weren't taking care. And Jefferson tried to get things back in order. And at some point, he just said, we talk about Jefferson as farmer. I'm a bad farmer, and I admit it. And he asked Jeff, would you take over my farm and run the business for me? Jefferson, I suppose, didn't want to be aggravated by that task. So Jeff took over his farm and ran the affairs. He became, in some sense, the master of Monticello in Jefferson. So Jefferson could write his letters and attend to that sort of business. So there was this intense love affair between the two men that I find really charming. That let's say he's his son, that a father could love his son so much and the son so much his father. So Thomas Jefferson Randolph realized, I think, he didn't have, and he didn't care. He didn't care that he wasn't as bright. He just, and they probably had discussions, just be who you are. He said he had a great moral heart. So he took over the affairs at Monticello, and Thomas Jefferson Randolph was, as far as I can ascertain, always well intended and always balanced.
Wow. Oh, that is so nice to know that they had a good relationship and nothing that was going on during the presidency and interfering with it. That's really nice to
We
know.
don't see that today that often, do we?
No. No. What a handsome young man. Okay. Well, we'd like to thank everyone for being here today with us. And our next episode will be Thomas Jefferson's letter to Benjamin Rush, dated the 23rd September, 1800. And in the letter, they talk about the yellow fever and naming objects after people that are still alive. So we'll find out more about that from Dr. Holowchak next week. If you'd like to contact Dr. Holowchak, you can reach him at mholowchak@hotmail.com. He's available for book promotions and seminars at your schools, universities, political groups, anything relevant to Thomas Jefferson. He's the guy. You can also reach him at his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And have we covered everything? And you have another book you're working on right now too.
I just finished it. It's called The World Without Thomas Jefferson. It's a sort of historical novel, counterfactual novel, and I'll be fishing that out to prospective publishers. It's a lot of fun. It's so
Okay.
we could talk about that at some other time.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. You're always doing great stuff for our founding father, and it's much appreciated. I know I've enjoyed the education I've received.
Just a lot of, for me, it's just a lot of fun, and it's astonishing that you could write 20 books, and I still have in mind, like you said, I talked about I want to have a collection of the letters between Thomas Jefferson and Maria Causeway coming up with commentary, as well as do a book on Thomas Jefferson, thoughts on war, revolution stuff. They're just there's no end. The
Yeah,
was so deep, and it was so wide that there are so many things about which to write if you have the energy and enthusiasm. And the other thing is, he was a good man. It's easy to want to write and want to share what you think about this man because he was a good man.
Yeah, and I think you're the perfect person to do it. I think we've talked about before, your training in philosophy and your education in philosophy also helps with understanding his writing, his words, and interpreting them from those times to now. So I think that's the most important, and what makes you the best Thomas Jefferson scholar.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Dr. Holowchak. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
We're very privileged to
Signing off, and we'll get ready to do this next Sunday.
Okay,
I
great.
got some gardening to do, and I think the other Jefferson wants to go outside to do his
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's
Well, thank you for joining us today, and everyone. And if you enjoyed the video, please give us a like and subscribe to our channels. Have a wonderful afternoon.